Hello, everyone. My name is Nikos Dumanis. I'm a professor of motivation science. I'm based at the University of Southern Denmark. And today I will present in a conversation with Hugh Riddell, a project we conducted in Australia on how motives and metacognitive strategies influence the pursuit of difficult goals and the disengagement from goals which are too difficult or unattainable. This project was funded by the Australian Research Council, and it lasted for about 3 years. So Hugh, do you want to put the slides up?
Absolutely. Thanks, Nikos. Thanks for the introduction, and I hope you enjoy the webinar. So yeah, as Nikos said, the project was about goal motives and metacognitive strategies and how they influence goal pursuit of difficult goals and disengagement from unattainable goals. I'd like to begin by thanking the ARC as well and recognising the wider research team that was involved on the project. So there's everyone there that was working with us.
Okay, so Hugh, the way I suggest we do this webinar is that I'll ask you some questions and then you take us through the slides, if it's okay with you.
Sounds good.
So I'll start with asking you, what was the rationale for the project?
Yeah, so being persistent when we pursue important goals is something that's really glorified in society. However, the wider picture is a bit more complicated. So the example that we kind of used at the very beginning of this project that drove this idea was the Greek myth of Sisyphus. So Sisyphus was the king of Corinth, I believe, who was sentenced to carry a boulder up a hill in Hades, only to have the boulder roll down every time he got to the top of the hill, and repeat this for eternity as his punishment. This story is quite an evocative representation of keeping going with something that just is never going to eventuate. It really highlights that there's times when people need to be strategic in their goal pursuit and decide when it's better to give up and adjust goals rather than persisting in the face of adversity. Fighting an uphill battle is necessary sometimes, but it's also important to know when to try a different approach. There's several problems with just persisting on unattainable goals. It can lead to things like rumination, intrusive thoughts, and stress. And can be detrimental for well-being. Obviously, we want to avoid that. Re-engagement or disengagement, sorry, and re-engagement are the ways that we can get around that. So disengagement entails letting go of an unfeasible goal, and re-engagement entails finding a new goal that you can pursue that fulfills similar needs to the original goal. And re-engaging can result in wellbeing outcomes that are similar to what you'd see as if you attain the goal in the absence of re-engagement.
Okay, thank you. So in this project, we're interested to look at predictors of and outcomes of disengagement and re-engagement. Can we talk a little bit about the theoretical frameworks that we use to study these predictors?
Yeah, so the big one was self-determination theory. The basic idea behind self-determination theory is that goal motives, that is the things that drive our goals, can be divided into two separate categories broadly. We talk about goals as being either autonomously motivated, which are goals that align with our sense of self and things that we value or strongly believe in. And then goals that are motivated by controlled motivation. These are things that are driven by like external drives, like guilt or shame or external pressures like financial reward. So typically what we know from self-determination theory is that people who pursue goals with autonomous motives are typically a lot more successful. One of the models that really captures why this happens is the self-concordance model by Sheldon and Elliott. So Sheldon and Elliott's self-concordance model says that goal self-concordance, or that is the degree to which a goal is driven by autonomous versus controlled motives, predicts sustained effort and proper self-regulation of a goal, which in turn leads to higher goal attainment, need-satisfying experiences, and ultimately improvements in well-being. One of the first outcomes of this project was a meta-analysis by our PhD student on the project, Berker. He actually looked at all the literature which has extended this self-concordance model to the dark side of goal striving. So that is how control-motivated goals affect self-regulation and goal striving outcomes and well-being. Berker showed that where self-concordant or autonomous goals are linked to positive self-regulatory behaviour, control-motivated goals are linked to negative self-regulatory behaviour and result in poorer outcomes for goal striving. So ideally, what we'd like to see is people driven by autonomous goals because they tend to attain their, driven by autonomous motives because they tend to attain their goals better. However, that's not always the case. There's also the other side of the equation, which is that there's research showing that people with autonomous motives tend to find it more difficult to disengage when goals become unattainable. So we're kind of faced with a two-headed problem, right? On the one hand, people with controlled motives, we need to help them find a way to stick with their goals better, self-regulate better, and reach their goals more successfully. And for people with autonomous motives, we need to find ways to encourage them to identify opportunities to disengage from unattainable goals so that they can re-engage and experience that successful goal pursuit.
Right. Thank you. So I guess you might ask why people with control goal motives should be helped to persist in their goal striving. I guess the answer here is that often we pursue goals that might not be intrinsically satisfying. For instance, spending evenings and weekends to revise before an academic exam. But these goals have desirable consequences.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so self-determination theory, and in particular self-concordance, the self-concordance model was one theoretical framework we used to study persistence and disengagement. And what was the other theoretical framework we used?
Yeah, so the other theoretical framework, which I will come to in the next slide, after I give this little bit of background information, is the tripartite model. Which essentially says that we can use metacognitive strategies, in particular this one metacognitive strategy called MCII, to interact with motives to help us better attain those positive outcomes. So the reason that I wanted to present MCII first and give you a quick overview of what it is so that our listeners understand kind of what I'm talking about when I say MCII, or what is the long name, which is mental contrasting with implementation intentions. So this is a metacognitive strategy that can help us improve goal attainment. It takes 4 pretty simple steps. So first, you state your goal. Second, you imagine the most positive outcome that you associate with attaining your goal. Then you contrast this with the reality that's standing in your way to help you identify obstacles to achieving your goal. And finally, make some if-then plans or implementation intentions, which can help you overcome obstacles. So the mental contrasting bit of MCII, which is this process of stating your goal, imagining positive outcomes, and then contrasting this with reality, it can help us strengthen commitment to goals when they're feasible. However, it reduces commitment or distances us from the goal when goals are unfeasible. And this conditional property is really critical. Because it comes down to this question of, well, how do we strengthen goal pursuit to goals which are attainable and reduce our commitment to goals which are unattainable? So you can see where that conditionality really becomes an important part. So going on to the tripartite model that I mentioned briefly before, it essentially predicts that certain outcomes should occur when, depending on whether a person is autonomously or motivated by autonomous and controlled goal motives when they use MCII. So key here is that MCII should help people with controlled goal motivation to commit to goals that are attainable, persist with those goals, and hopefully benefit from persistence by attaining the goals and the well-being outcomes that are following on from that. On the other hand, MCII should help people with autonomous motives identify those obstacles which are just impossible to overcome. And they should have also, through the implementation intention part, have identified ways that they could adapt or change their goal striving should obstacles that are insurmountable kind of arise. So in this way, MCAI should help people with autonomous motivation to disengage and re-engage. And then again, these people should then be able to reap the benefits of re-engaged goal pursuit.
Okay, so we use the tripartite model to study both predictors and outcomes of goal disengagement and re-engagement, as well as goal persistence. Can you go through the first series of studies we did, Hugh?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first series of studies was a series of 3 lab-based experiments in which we wanted to look at these kind of really basic predictions of the tripartite model, namely whether or not MCAI can help people with different motives to either persist with attainable goal pursuit or disengage and re-engage from unattainable goal pursuit. In the first study, we wanted to look at whether MCAI can encourage people to persist with a difficult but attainable goal when their motivation is controlled. In the second study, we wanted to look at whether MCAI can encourage disengagement from unattainable goals when motivation is autonomous. And in the third study, we wanted to look at whether MCAI and motives interact to predict strategic goal selection when people are faced with multiple goals which are competing, and whether or not this strategic selection of choosing an attainable goal over competing unattainable goals will lead to improvements in goal striving. So the outcomes of these 3 experiments, just generally summed up together, is that we found strong support for the proposal that controlled motivation really helps out people persist with, that controlled motivation is associated with poor ways to strive for goals. So essentially people appraised goals as threats and engaged in coping strategies that were maladaptive and didn't really help them persist with their goals. However, MCAI helped people with controlled motivation to persist with these goals by reducing these or buffering these negative effects that controlled motivation was having on goal regulatory behaviour. The other findings were that MCAI and autonomous motives consistently predicted goal re-engagement when goals were unattainable. But interestingly, and kind of counter to our predictions, we didn't find a significant interaction between autonomous motivation and MCAI. We did find that people who were autonomously motivated and chose to adjust their goals, though, rather than persisting with multiple incongruent goals, they displayed more goal progress and were generally able to attain their goals better. So it does show that this autonomous motivation is positive when people are able to disengage and can help them persist through to a re-engage, or sorry, persist once they've re-engaged and attain those goals after re-engagement.
Right, and control motives are maladaptive, but in terms of persistence, but when people are able to use MCAI, then the negative effect of control motives on persistence is buffered. Yeah,
exactly. And that's a finding that actually continued through to some of our other studies, which I can explain now if you'd like me to.
Okay. Yeah, so we did this series of lab-based studies, but we also did some field studies with real goals. Can you talk about them as well, Hugh?
Absolutely. So yeah, it's really important to take those findings out of the lab and see if they apply to real world goals when people are doing the things that they do in day-to-day life, right? So our first study was, or our first field study, sorry, was looking at how parents strive for multiple goals, or how they balance that life with the early stages of parenting. So we recruited a group of parents from Australia, the UK and the US, and had them do a diary study that persisted over several weeks, where they reported every few days how they were going on their goals and the various processes that they were using. We also investigated how they used spontaneous MCII, that is, how their cognitions just happen to align with those that people who are trained to do MCII typically use. We expected that having autonomous versus control motives should foster effective self-regulation, better goal management, and increase the likelihood of goal attainment. We also thought that MCII should interact with goal motives to predict regulation and goal attainment. So as I said, these results turned out pretty similar to what we saw in our original series of studies, lab studies, sorry. We saw that both MCII and goal motives positively, as autonomous goal motives, sorry, positively predicted efficacious self-regulatory mechanisms like effort-based coping and goal adjustment, which in turn led to inter-goal facilitation, so more synergy between parenting goals and life goals, and more goal progress. On the other hand, controlled motives were either negatively linked to these effective mechanisms or linked to ineffective mechanisms like disengagement coping. We also saw relationships then to inter-goal interference. So less synergy between these goals. What was really unique about this study is because we had that fidelity of data where we could measure people on every few days, we could look at how effects were related both on a day-to-day basis, how these variables influence people's striving on a day-to-day basis, as well as how it differentiated effective strivers from ineffective strivers. So really, what were the things that helped out, what made one day better than the other, or what made one person better at goal striving than the other? And we saw a similar kind of pattern across those two levels, which is what I've just described to you before.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to ask about the second study, but you've got a slide, so please carry on. Yeah,
so our second study was looking at that persistent side of the equation rather than the re-engagement side of the equation, the adjustment side of the equation. Here we were looking at how motivation and MCII can really act as building blocks for developing effective saving habits over the long term. So what's really interesting is that saving money, or generally wealth-related goals, are often thought of traditionally as being really associated with these controlled motives and external drivers. Like one of the things I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar is that financial rewards are often seen as like a classic driver of controlled motivation. So we really wanted to see whether autonomously motivated, or there can be autonomous motivation for saving and striving for those wealth-related goals, whether or not we see these effects turn into positive self-regulatory behaviours and goal attainment in the long term, and whether this whole process of saving can constitute a really satisfying process for people. So yeah, we recruited a group of people and followed them over 6 months as they tried to work on their saving goals. We were interested in what are the different self-regulatory coping mechanisms they use and how does that affect their goal performance. As we can see here, again, the results lined up really nicely with what we'd seen in our lab-based studies. So autonomous motives were related to improvements in task-based coping over the course of the study, which were related to goal progress and need satisfaction. On the other hand, controlled motives were linked to growing disengagement coping, so avoidance of the saving goal, which was linked to need frustration. What we saw was that MCII interacted with controlled motivation to buffer those negative effects that controlled motivation had. So essentially, we saw that people who engaged in MCII didn't have those negative effects of controlled motivation. So it's not necessarily that they did better, it's that they didn't have the negative effects of controlled motivation on their goal striving.
So this seems to be a consistent pattern across several studies with different designs and populations, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So yeah, the findings that we found in the lab-based studies generally align really well with those field-based studies. Two of the big ones we found were that autonomous motivation facilitates goal attainment by encouraging task-based coping, but also re-engagement, and that MCAI facilitates goal attainment by encouraging task-based coping as well, but then also buffering the negative effects of controlled motivation.
Okay.
A couple of the other novel findings that kind of went beyond the lab-based studies, I think, were that our parenting study shed light on how motivation can influence multiple goal management. So really those positive coping strategies that were associated with autonomous motivation produced intergoal facilitation, both within, so on the day-to-day basis and differentiated the person-to-person basis. So people with autonomous motives had more synergy between their goals or in their goals, from day to day, but these people who had more synergy also typically, these people with autonomous motivation also had typically more synergy overall than people who were less autonomously motivated. And then the savings study showed that MCAI and goal motives can predict longitudinal improvements in goal regulation, which is, and that these lead to better goal attainment, which kind of bridges the gap that's in the literature there.
Okay. Sorry, can you go one slide back? I just want to explain one thing that was mentioned in the slide. So in testing our model, we use priors from two other meta-analyses. So we use information published or available to us about how these variables are related. And one of them was published meta-analysis on MCAI. The second one is meta-analysis that Hugh mentioned earlier that one of our students has conducted, persist, which at the time of this recording, today is the 17th of November 2023, is still under review. So in this meta-analysis, we have actually analyzed a fair number of studies, 70, 80, I can't remember now the top of my head, on the self-concordance model. And we hope to have this paper published soon. And this paper is the first integrated review of the self-concordance model in the literature.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Nikos. Yeah, that's a strength of this study that I forgot to mention as well, that, yeah, we did take into account that prior information and like what we already know about autonomous and controlled motives and MCAI to kind of build on the results of this study. Okay.
So after the 3 lab-based studies and the 2 field-based studies, here we concluded this ARC-funded project with a big meta-analytic review, which is also at the moment under review. And this is the last study. It tries to bring together different literatures and proposes a new conceptual model on goal adjustment. We're looking at the different facets of goal adjustment, what predicts goal adjustment, what are the consequences of the different facets of goal adjustment. Can you talk a little bit about this review, please, Hugh?
Absolutely. So, yeah, one of the things that we really learnt across conducting these 5 studies was that the literature on goal adjustment in particular is really fragmented. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's from different theoretical frameworks and spread across multiple life domains. And as a consequence of that, there's no real guiding framework that tells us really what are the things we should look at that are important when we talk about goal adjustment, or what's been looked at and considered important in the existing literature. So as you said, Nikos, we went through and did a systematic review and meta-analysis of all the various antecedents and a few outcomes of goal adjustment. We ended up with almost 200 studies that were included in that review. And as a consequence, really speaking to that point that I had before, that this literature is really fragmented, we decided that the best way to proceed here was to build an integrative framework that kind of provided some cohesion to that, the space. So what we ended up doing was developing a conceptual model. This conceptual model, which is displayed on the slide, essentially arose because we arose when we put the various antecedents and outcomes into larger overarching categories. So these categories are represented by the circles on the left-hand and right-hand sides of the diagram. We also saw that goal adjustment could be broadly separated into 3 different categories. So a person's overarching goal flexibility, that is their general predisposition to being flexible during their goal striving. But then also goal level disengagement and re-engagement, which is kind of what we'd looked at through our 5 studies. So in other words, we have processes which occur at this person level and determine a person's overall propensity towards goal adjustment. But then we also have goal level processes which are unique for each individual goal that a person strives for and determines whether or not they're going to persist or change that goal. Whether or not they're going to disengage and re-engage from that goal. So just to kind of give you a bit of an overview of how we group different things, I'll give you a few examples from the various categories of antecedents that we had. So developmental factors, which is the first bubble on the top left-hand side of the diagram, are things that occur across the lifetime and determine a person's overall propensity towards flexibility. So there's a whole bunch of literature stemming from Brandstatter and Renner's dual process model, which suggests that goal flexibility should change over the lifetime, and as people age, they should become more used to adjusting their goals and more flexible. And that's where this idea of developmental factors came from. Agency speaks to the amount of control that a person or the possibility that a person has to exert control over their goals. So things like socioeconomic status could come into that. A person who has the possibility to pursue multiple different avenues will typically have a higher level of overall possibility to be flexible. And then the final bubble on the at the person level are those dispositional traits, which speak to things like personality factors that come into determining who a person is and how open they are to things like goal flexibility. Then moving to the bottom half of the model, which describes goal level processes, the first thing we come across is characteristic adaptations, which describe these goal level states that a person is in when they're pursuing a goal. So how a person might feel about their particular goal, say their affect, could predict both their ideas to disengage or re-engage from that specific goal. Contextual factors speak to the things that are going on in that person's situation at a given time that can influence their goal disengagement or re-engagement. So this might be something like feedback from someone else that's coming in and telling people that they're not doing very well. And then finally, goal-specific factors are those things which are related really specifically to the goal. So we classified things like motivation under this category here. So it's really something that pertains to a specific goal and will dictate a disengagement or re-engagement from that goal. Then kind of moving to the right-hand side of the model, the different outcomes we looked at, the big ones were well-being and ill-being. We found that a lot of the literature has focused on this, on well-being and ill-being as an outcome. And that probably stems from this idea that the original theories by Roche and colleagues, Carver and Shire, people like that really said that appropriate adjustment of goals should lead to an overall healthier person. So we saw a whole bunch of outcomes like psychological health occurring under or being grouped under that bubble. The other one was functioning and impairment. So people who adjust goals should be able to live their lives better on the day-to-day basis because they're able to overcome problems and find new ways to do things. So we found a little bit of evidence that flexibility, a person's typical flexibility or overall flexibility does improve functioning, but less specific evidence that goal disengagement and re-engagement at the goal level really predict day-to-day functioning, which was kind of surprising. Then moving to the bottom half of the model again, the outcome that we focused on or really found a lot of evidence for at the goal level were those goal-related outcomes. So things like goal progress, and yeah, we saw positive associations with associations between disengagement and goal-striving outcomes. And surprisingly, we didn't see a lot of evidence, or didn't find consistent evidence, I should say, that re-engagement was tied to goal-striving outcomes. But that might be because of the ways that goal-striving outcomes are measured in relation to re-engagement and the consistency there. So things like it's difficult to operationalize, do we talk about goal progress in terms of the original goal or the re-engaged goal, things like that. So yeah, I think this model really highlights that this space, although there's a lot of work out there and we can tie it together to a certain degree, there's a lot that still needs to be done.
Yeah, but I think it's a very comprehensive model, and credit to you for leading this effort, Hugh. And we hope that this model will serve as a reference point for future researchers in this field who want to examine all the different diseases and consequences of goal adjustment. So we move on to the next slide, talking a little bit about future research directions.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think one of the big things is moving beyond things like motives and MCII to testing a more comprehensive model, particularly in that goal adjustment space. So what we saw in the meta-analysis is that while motives and MCII were both significant predictors of goal adjustment, there were a whole bunch of other factors that predicted goal adjustment as well. So kind of bringing all those things together and looking at a more interrelated picture of how a person's overall, person level factors, who they are, relates then as well to how the motives they have for a particular goal, and how then that all comes together to determine whether or not they want to persist or adjust their goals. And speaking to that point, moving beyond just goal adjustment. So a big picture would have a model that includes both adjustment and persistence and determines what are those factors that decide whether a person's going to persist or adjust with their goals. Another big one would be how to maximize the effectiveness of MCII. So we saw that MCII can work in tandem with motives, but there's still spaces in that literature to potentially improve the effectiveness of that relationship. For example, we don't know what the optimal dosage of MCII is. So is it enough to just do one course of MCII, or does doing MCII every day improve outcomes even more? And then also, how does MCII work when you've got two or more multiple goals? So we did look at that to some extent in our studies, but there's a lot of space in this area to kind of look at that and expand beyond two goals even. And that kind of comes to my last point, is that we looked at the situation of two competing goals, but what about goals that kind of complement one another and work in synergy? How does MCII and motives play into that situation? And how does it fit into the broader picture of persistence and adjustment? And those are kind of the big points that I think that we can take away from the work that we've done here. Okay,
thank you very much, Hugh. I guess the overall theme behind this project was to challenge the idea and the notion of never giving up. We know that we see Hollywood movies where heroes overcome massive adversities to achieve success, but in real life we have to be strategic in how we invest our limited resources, and sometimes disengagement from unattainable goals is beneficial not only for our psychological health but also and physical health, but also in terms of helping us to accomplish other goals further down the line. And we hope this series of studies provide some ideas of how we can do that. And of course, as Hugh said, that there are many other possibilities for future research. We would like to invite any of you who is interested in our studies to contact either Hugh and or myself if you want to discuss the studies further, or have any other ideas for future collaboration. And we hope that the two reviews, one led by our student Berke and the other one that Hugh presented at the end of the webinar, discussing the different antecedents and consequences of goal adjustment, should be available sometime early in 2024. And with this, I would like again to thank Hugh actually for did most of the work in presenting what we did over a period of 3.5 or so years, and also our collaborators and our universities, and of course the Australian Research Council for funding this work. Hugh, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think that pretty much sums it up nicely, Nikos. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about the work today, and thanks to everyone who's paid attention and is listening.